Yeah, it's a good turnout. I was a little surprised with the weather being so nice.
Oh,
That everybody's out raking the lawn.
Yeah.
that's it.
I got a choice for breaking the lawn or come listen to me.
Right.
I'm surprised anybody's here. It's going to take me a couple minutes to set up, so why don't we do a 7-inning stretch?
All right.
Come on.
Okay, who wants?
Sporting goods within a 50-mile radius of West Winfield, and one remains, of course, up in Dallasville. These are all manufacturers that at some time or another I'd done a little research project on, a couple of them for historical societies, Winona County and Herkimer County, and another just basically out of interest that I published in the Star some time ago, probably back in the late 90s. So we're going to kick off with the earliest manufacturer to gain notoriety from the area. And so to get started, picture this. We're going back to the turn of the century, the last century, 1900. And there's a young woodworker who's finishing up for the day and getting ready to close shop. When he goes to lock the door, there's a young man there with a broken stick, asking him if he could possibly turn him a baseball bat for a game that night. So the woodworker takes the stick, takes the measurements, pulls a piece of ash out of his wood bin, and spends a few minutes and turns him a nice baseball bat. Well, that night, the young man goes out and he hits safely every time he's at bat. So the next afternoon, the whole team's there winning bats. And that's supposedly how Kren Bats got started. The story was told to me by this gentleman here, whose name is Joseph Kren. He's the youngest of 4 sons of Joe Kren, who was the woodworker at that time. I had an opportunity to speak to Mr. Kren on a couple occasions in the late 90s before he passed away, somewhere around the age of 100. So it wasn't long before Joe Kren left his furniture business and started making bats on a full-time basis. He became a supplier to the International League, which had teams in Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo back then. And a lot of the well-known players in the International League used his bats, including a guy named Bill Kelly, who was a Central New York legend, I guess, and a fellow named Jimmy Walsh, who eventually made it up to the Philadelphia Athletics. Some of the other athletics started using the bats as well, and it also began a lifelong friendship between Joe Kren and Connie Mack. Now, Joe Kren himself, the elder Joe Kren, had come here from Austria sometime around 1888, started his woodworking shop. And he was originally located in the Beecher Street area, Syracuse, which I'm not sure where that is. But the factory that he ended up building was on Bear Street, which is somewhere in the vicinity of where Destiny USA is now. Now, young Joe didn't work in the shop with his father and his brothers. He was basically involved with marketing. And he told me probably his proudest moments were the opportunity to see Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and Joe DiMaggio all hit home runs using Kren bats. This bat here we can pass around. This is a Ruth style bat. It's probably a store bat just because it has the Ruth style designation on it. There's some collectors who say that these could have been game used by the players whose name appear on there. But I think it's probably pretty unlikely that it was. Generally what happened with the Kren bats, if they were game used by the player, it would just have the last name of the player on there. But this is a 36-inch bat, and it's probably about as close to a Ruth game bat as you ever have a chance to hold. Now, you notice this one has a chip out of it or a crack. What would happen back in those days, in the 30s, 20s and 30s, that if a major league ball player broke a bat and you wanted to order new bats, you just took a stamp and a label on the bat and send it in the mail back to the factory, along with a request of how many bats you wanted to have made. And this is a little smaller version. This is the salesman sample. So there were several other players back in that time period. We used Kren bats on a regular basis. It included Hack Wilson, Randall, Charlie Gehringer, and Jimmy Fox. And as happens with a lot of the bat companies, they ended up getting wiped out by a fire. And Kren's fire happened in 1939. What happened was they lost a lot of their patterns and the original bats that they had for a lot of the ball players. So Kren went on, rebuilt the plant, and eventually passed away in 1953. And none of the sons wanted to continue the bat company. So it was sold to an outfit out of White Hills, Pennsylvania, called Wood Manufacturing. And they in turn did produce print bats for a while before discontinuing it and going out of business. Back in the late 70s, what was left of the Kren archives was purchased by a band named Ron Gersbacher, who was the publicity manager for the Syracuse Chiefs. So I'll pass this around to
When they rebuilt, they built in the same spot.
I believe so, yeah.
And where did you meet him? Where did he live?
He was actually in an old people's home, senior citizen home housing on James Street in Syracuse.
Oh,
And he was just about blind at that point. And the bat that he's holding was a gang-used Irish miso bat that he had at one time. So that's pretty much the story of Kren bats. The next manufacturer I wanted to talk about is a little closer to home, and that was the Kenwell Company. Has anybody heard of the Kenwell Company? Okay. They were started back in the around 1920. There were 6 Kennedy brothers named Alan Morris, who was a doctor, Bert, Philip, Nelson, and Jack. There's some discrepancy as far as where they were actually from. I've heard they were mostly from Utica. Well, I've also read that they were originally from New York City. But in any case, they bought out the Wells Glove Company in Gloversville and began manufacturing baseball gloves. Now, this here style was early innovation on their behalf, on their part. And they were one of the first glove companies to lace the fingers together. I think if most of you have seen old gloves, a lot of them were the style here, or what they call the split finger.
these all years ago?
Yeah. And the first model to come out that looked like that with the laced fingers was called the Daisy Vance model after Dodgers pitcher. And it wasn't long before, well, according to Kenwell's literature anyway, a majority of Major League ball players were using Kenwell gloves. Ellen Kennedy was a personal friend of Lou Gehrig, which probably helped get them in the major leagues as well. Probably the most famous Kenwell glove was first baseman's mitt with a zipper back that was endorsed by Gehrig. This is not that glove, but it was very similar to this, except it had a zipper running up and down to tighten it on your hand. So around 1927, they'd grown to about the size of 50 employees. and came to Utica. Now, they were originally located where the Route 8 overpass goes over Genesee Street. And they were there for about 5 years, and the company more than doubled in size, and they ended up moving down to Catherine Street, which is kind of down in the area where Risky Boulevard becomes 5S. Just east of the train station. And at their peak, they had about 300 employees. In addition, they started making other items, producing other items, including tennis rackets and baseball bats. This was much later in the company's history. This is in the early 50s. It's a Jackie Robinson model bat. As I said, I worked on a Kenwell exhibit for the United County Historical Society, and part of my research was I put an ad in the local penny saver, asking anybody who was familiar with the company to contact me. And I did have one gentleman who was a wealth of information, who had worked with them. And some of the things he told me that I hadn't known or hadn't seen anywhere else was that probably most of you are familiar with the Wilson Glove Company, Wilson Sporting Goods. Wilson owned a number of ranches out in the Midwest, cattle ranches, and that's where they got their leather. And what they would do is they traded leather to Kenwell in return for Kenwell manufacturing some of their early baseball gloves back in the 30s and 40s. And Kenwell also produced gloves with the Sears, Western Auto, and other names on them as well, probably Ward's and a lot of the other generic box stores of their day. So the brother Alan became sole owner in the early 1950s, and he sold it to a fellow named Lawrence Kennedy from Elmira in 1952. Gloves continue to be produced under the name Kennedy, and eventually he went out of business around 1960. Now the name Kenwell's been revived in recent years by a company called Academia, I believe it is, and what they do is reproduce some of the more famous gloves as collector's items. So we pass around some more items here. Did we do the first baseman's glove yet?
No.
Okay. That's from the 1930s. That's a George Grantham model. This particular piece here is rare. This is an original box glove from around 1940. Probably won't pass this around because of the box, but it's a Lonnie Fry model. Lonnie Fry played shortstop for the Dodgers and the Cincinnati Reds. And anybody have an idea what this might be? Now I believe, this is something I picked up at the flea market back probably about 20 years ago. And I believe what it is actually a salesman's sample of the top of the line baseball made by Kenwell. And if you look closely, besides seeing what the guts of the baseball looks like, you notice the stitching is in red and green. Up till the early 1930s, that was the way most baseballs were stitched, using alternating colors. They started using just red for the stitching. So that dates that probably around 1930.
So Bill, then this looks like it's got like a cork in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
and then some sort of a.
Yeah, it's corked, wrapped by rubber, then wool yarn. And this is a copy of their catalog from 1939. Now, I also heard some old-timers in Utica that said they would remember going to the Ken Welsh factory store, and there used to be a big bin of seconds. The baseball gloves, and you used to be able to buy a great glove for like 50 cents.
That's when 50 cents was.
Yeah.
20 bucks now.
Everything.
So that's a brief overview of Kenwell. Now, the third manufacturer I wanted to talk about, we're probably more familiar with, and that's up in Dolgeville, and that's Adirondack Bats. Now, Adirondack Bats began around 1946, and was started by a gentleman called Edward McLaughlin, who used to work for Louisville Slugger. And Louisville Slugger got most all of the wood they used for their bats from patches in the southern Adirondacks, south central Adirondacks. And apparently, Mr. McLaughlin at one time had been a supervisor for a cutting crew. So with the war ending, he figured that the bat market was going to explode, which it did, and he decided to start his own company. So he bought a sawmill, went into the manufacturing business, and he teamed up with an accountant named Millard, and theirs were the names that appeared on the first labels of the Adirondack bat. Now this here was another little trademark thing they came out with, whereas most bats are read this direction. They use what is referred to
Well,
now as
one's a
reverse
left-hander and one's a right-hander.
Yeah, this here is the early DiMaggio model. And probably the biggest thing McLaughlin did was he hired another Dolgeville boy named Hal Schumacher to make him vice president in charge of marketing. Is anybody familiar with Hal Schumacher at all? He pitched for the New York Giants back in the 30s. Yeah, he and Carl Hubbell were probably one of the top 1-2 punches on the mound back in those days. Now, the big advantage of having Schumacher on board was he had direct lines to a lot of the major league teams, and it wasn't long before Adirondack Bats started appearing in major league ballparks. One of the teams he dealt with a lot were the Tigers, and another team was the St. Louis Cardinals. Some of the outstanding players who had used exclusively Adirondack bats in the early days were Bobby Thompson, Hank Bauer, and Willie Mays. The story of Mays was interesting because he was one of the real early black endorsers. And apparently Adirondack had snatched him up, signed him up when he was still in the minor leagues, even before he made it to the Giants. So I think we've all heard of the endorsement agreements a lot of ball players and sports figures make nowadays, like $1 million to put their name on a pair of sneakers. Well, this is actually a list of some of the endorsement fees that were paid to players back around 1950. And most of them range from around $50 to, I think Stan Musial was the top on the list at around $300. He had his name on the bat.
Is that for every bat?
Sorry?
Is that for every bat?
They wishing it was for everything.
It would be today.
So this is Ted Williams' bat. What Adirondack Bat did was they went out and they purchased some bats from about every major ball player there was at that time.
Do they have some kind of a museum or showcase where you can go and see all these different things?
In Dolgeville. Yeah, when I did this for Garfield County Historical Society back around '99 or so, and when I went to talk to them, get some information, there was one person who was kind of designated as the company historian, a guy named Bill Steele, and it wasn't long. And here's some samples of some early catalogs.
Where do you get a lot of your things? You said flea markets and.
Flea markets.
Yeah.
And it's interesting,
Auctions.
I don't know, and you probably remember Bob Smith, Bob and Myrna Smith.
Yes.
Yeah, they had both worked at Adirondack Bat.
Oh,
Yeah. And I had a couple bats from Bob. This is a Stan Musial model, which, interesting enough, I found a picture in a sports magazine of Musial and Williams. And Musial's holding a exact duplicate of this. And I don't know if any of you remember, Bob used to have a Reggie Jackson bat. It was actually a game-used Reggie. That I guess they were gonna throw out, so he brought it home from work, and he had it hanging around in his living room. So as far as the company history goes, Millard and McLaughlin parted ways around 1958. And they started using a label similar to this, with the names off of it. McLaughlin died in 1960, his wife took over the company. And she was bought out in 1967 by a company called Roland Controller Company, which apparently is an investment company out of Maryland. And they started diversifying a little bit more. This is a catalog from 1969. I think this mostly is still all bats, but they started making other wood products like toboggans. And every once in a while, you go into an antique store and you find an Adirondack toboggan. Adirondack toboggan.
now were these all, did everything they make, were they ash filled or not? Did they use?
I believe so. Well, most everything, at least 90% of what they produce.
Yeah, because everything here says white ash.
Yeah.
Does Adirondack make any of the naval bats?
They may now, I don't know. I mean, they certainly have the resources to do so.
I don't know, the guy who's the manager at Adirondack Bats, a Winfield boy.
Was he?
Yeah, Gary Vandergraaf, who used to ride in the school bus.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I can't think of his first name right now, but he's been manager up there for a number of years.
Oh, wow. So anyway, in 1971, Adirondack was bought out by Figge International, F-I-G-G-I-E, who also owned a number of other sporting goods companies, including Rawlings. In 1975, they merged Rawlings with the Adirondack Bat, and since that time, everything produced has been under the Rawlings trademark. Here's a game model Mark Dwyer bat.
So did Adirondacks capture the market as far as from 5-year-olds all the way up, you know, all the little leagues and the schools, and was that all across the country and all across the world? Were they-
Yeah, supposedly they're second only to Louisville Slugger in manufacture of bats. Now, Bob Royce used to work for Stetson Harza, And Stetson House, they have a project up there for the bat company, and Bob picked up these for me. Recognize what they are? Any guesses?
The stubs out of the lathe, aren't they?
Right, the stuff's
Oh my
off the handle
Okay.
a little bit.
Oh, wait.
But this was off the Darryl Strawberry Pro Bat.
We used to have a guy deliver us
This was off the
the
Mark McGuire.
broken stubs, and my mother burned them in a kitchen stove for years. Guy would come with a dump truck, with all this short pieces of baseball bat.
Hey.
Well, you could probably answer this. They had a fire, and Bill Steele wasn't sure when the fire was.
They've had a number of, some of them disastrous, but most of them minor. It's, generally, they have fires in the dry kilns.
But I know one of the players, they lost all their old player model bats that were worth
Oh,
thousands
Priceless.
of dollars.
Yeah.
You know, those stubs look a lot better than the ones, like the one Kathy has.
Well, that's what they start with.
Did they,
And then they file them down or whatever.
They'd probably put on a duplicator, which might carve 10 or 12 bats at a time. And then they might go to a van who might just finish them off and sand them, and
did the dimensions more or less stay about the same, or were they refined a bit over the years?
Well, it depends on the model bats, because, you know, each player would have their own specific specifications as to how thick the handle should be, and same with the barrel, the taper of the bat, and so
Weight.
forth.
like,
Like,
Yeah, and like Dave was saying, when we do this, they would make a pattern, and they would use that pattern when you're creating each new bat. So basically, that's about all I've got.
I got a science question for you. When we
Sure.
were kids, we always were supposed to look at this. Is there something, would you break the bat if you hit it like that?
Yes, and the reason being is because they always wanted you to hit off the edge of the grain.
oh.
If you hit it off the face of the bat, what would happen is they would tend to split.
So they were.
So I wonder if metal bats had any, or what, I don't even know, how
I
old are
think
metal bats?
they went to metal bats, I think, because of all the broken bats, and they went to metal bats for college ball,
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was back, what, early 90s?
you know? And it's got such a dull thud to it when they get to play. It takes the fun out of listening to the ball game.
yeah.
Yeah, and one of the reasons they didn't do that in the majors, I heard, was, or I understand, is because if the major leaguers used metal bats, then they'd be getting 25 home runs a game or something like that. It would be outrageous.
Interesting.
Yeah, the bats, what the bats do actually is they add some element of,
Mystique.
Mistake,
yeah. 'Cause you never know what's gonna happen.
But I'm sure a lot of people have seen when they split and they go toward the second baseman or the shortstop. They're really hauling when they,
Yeah. Well, a couple of years ago, wasn't there a minor league coach, that third base coach they got, the older one?
could
Died.
be, you know?
So basically, that's a kind of a rough overview of the three major manufacturers.
Bill, on the way, the back way to Cooperstown, there is an Adirondack bank, that, do they just sell them there?
Yeah, probably.
It's a pretty big building.
Yeah, well, there's a couple bat manufacturers down in Cooperstown too. There's one that goes by the name of where it all began, and there's another one called Cooperstown Bats. So, from what I understand, one company's actually produce game breeder bats.
Okay.
They're souvenir style bats.
Cause they're Murphys, they're Sherry Obenesser is Jim, or
Overrated.
Yeah,
Oberrider
because Obernesters are
is
right.
related to the Murphys here.
Oh,
Since we got a
They
minute,
just did, their bats were more, what did they do with those bats? Those are more souvenir, or did
Yeah.
they
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so the
They're
baseball
commemorative
bats.
bats.
commemorative now?
Yeah, commemoratives.
Now, you do Cooperstown a lot. Did you ever go to the Farmers Museum and play the stickball, the
No.
original stickball?
Yeah.
I watched them play. It's funny.
I
The ball
actually got,
almost looks soft. It's like a leather, looser looking.
Mm-hmm.
Bill, I actually played on Abner Doubleday's field,
Oh, did you?
yeah, in high school, yeah.
That must have been
yeah, I
It
think,
was a thrill,
thrill, yeah.
yeah.
I think I did too.
yeah, the kids still
Wanna
do.
say your
In
poem?
the sixties or something? That was a cute poem, I loved it.
Yeah. You want it? I'll
I
suggest
don't
it.
think, Bill, I don't wanna overshadow.
Well, I got
Would
it.
you like his poem, to hear his poem?
Sure you got.
Might want him to put it in the paper.
I didn't bring any copies,
Oh,
Is it copy?
But,
Go
uh,
ahead, let's hear it.
Put your head down.
this ball game actually happened in late spring 1958. It's 57 years ago. I've carried it in my head all those years, and I just last year put it to paper. And it starts out, school is out, and the race is on. To the locker room we ran. To suit up for the game that day, to beat Richfield, we'd need to have a plan. Well, we piled into Len's gray Buick for that ride to Richfield Town. We found the field behind Smith's Ford to be dry and hard and brown. Well, the game got off to a real slow pace as the pitchers held it to a tie. The boys on the base pads had a real busy day, taking care of all the fly balls ground balls and flies. As I stepped up to the batter's box in the top of the third that day, Coach Hoyer yelled, "Pick a good one, Dave," as he cheered us on our way. Well, he pitched me in and he pitched me out, and then he threw one down the pike. And the umpire called strike 2 on me as I swung with all my might. Well, the count stood 2-2, you see, as I gripped my bat real hard. The next pitch met with a real loud crack. Boy, I sure hope it left the yard. Well, I watched that ball go off my bat. With much quickness it did fly. And when it hit the ground that day, boy, how the dust did rise. Well, I rounded first. The ball was gone. I've got to hit it last. Hoofed it hard into second base as the fielder was running fast. I picked up speed and headed for third, and now I was having fun. And the third base coach hollered, "Don't stop here. Take it home, Dave. Run, run, run." Well, I rounded third and headed for home, and who was I to see? Coach Hoyer, who was all doubled over, laughing just as hard as he could be. Well, I watched that ball come into second base, and the baseman held his throat. For he could see there was no play to make, for Winfield had just put on a show. Well, the boys from Richfield all stood there. They were looking mighty stunned, for they'd all just seen an old ground ball turned into a big home run.
Wow. Well, can I?
It's been called by a primary hobby publication. It's called Sports Collectors Digest. Up until a few years ago, they were probably the dominant publication in the hobby, and they called the show one of the best small shows in the country. So my partner actually started the show back in the late '70s. His name was Don Dwelling. He used to be head basketball coach down in Oneonta.
Many years ago, when I was on the road all the time, I had to go to Syracuse Airport and get Johnny Bench's family from off a plane. and take them down for induction weekend. And they invited me to go to the Otisanga and have lunch with them.
Oh my
It
gosh,
was pretty nice.
neat.
Yeah, but Mitch is funny. You catch him in the right mood, he can be a heck of a nice guy, but, yeah, he's been full of himself too a lot of the time. But I guess he's got a right to be. He was probably best catcher ever in baseball, so.
The Yankees, when they went to Virginia Tech the year after the shootings and played the Virginia Tech baseball team.
Oh my gosh, did they really?
And they were wonderful. I guess they signed anything, and they came over like,
Greg has got somebody in
yeah, they came over and sat, you know, on the bench. Some of them did with the, and they all got to play against them. I think this wasn't too bad a score. But of course, they didn't. But it was a nice gesture for sure. They gave quite a donation, I think.
Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Bill, that was very good.